What's happening, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking Set. This week, 4 Blackwater contractors responsible for the 2007 Nasser Square massacre that left 17 civilians dead in Iraq were convicted in a U.S. court on charges ranging from murder to manslaughter. Combined, the men face over a century in prison. So, justice is finally served, right? Well, except for the fact that the most guilty man of all will probably never see the inside of a courtroom or jail cell for his role in these and countless more war crimes. Yes, I'm talking about the modern mercenary industry founder, former Blackwater CEO Eric Prince. See, Prince considers his part in murdering innocent civilians around the world with no oversight God's work. And as history repeats itself, this neo-crusader has gotten off scot-free while the U.S. continues to shower his former company with billions of dollars in government contracts. See, believe it or not, there's a treaty in existence that bans this type of lawlessness. It's called the UN International Convention Against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, and states that these types of activities violate principles of international law, such as those of sovereign equality, political independence, territorial integrity of states, and self-determination of peoples. Wait, so how the hell is America allowed to send in these goon squads all over the world without the UN flipping out? Well, as with many UN resolutions attempting to rein in the military-industrial complex, the U.S. simply never signed it. And furthermore, our own justice system has had its hands tied for years when it comes to prosecuting monsters like Prince and his roving band of guns for hire. In the wake of the Blackwater convictions, Senator Patrick Leahy and Congressman David Prince introduced legislation to provide actual accountability for government contractors in the future. In a statement, Leahy said the bottom line is if contractors working on behalf of the U.S. commit crimes abroad, DOJ should be able to prosecute them. Word. And despite how many low-level employees go to prison over this scandal, justice won't truly be had until war criminal Eric Prince is rotting away next to them. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking set.
Over the last few weeks, 2 surprising decisions emerged from Sweden and the UK. Earlier this month, the center-left government of Sweden announced for the first time it would be recognizing the state of Palestine. Just days later, the UK Parliament followed suit with members overwhelmingly voting to recognize Palestine as well. But while this may appear to be a major step in the right direction, some activists say that this move in fact legitimizes Israel's current status quo in the region. To discuss this news, as well as other recent developments, I'm joined now by Miko Piled, the son of a former IDF general and author of the book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Always amazing to have you on, Miko.
Thanks, pleasure to be here.
So, basically, these recent decisions by Sweden and the UK seems like something that Palestinians should be celebrating. You disagree. Why?
Well, I think had the decision said something like, we recognize that there is a Palestine that is occupied, we realize that there's a brutal, oppressive apartheid regime that has occupied Palestine and has been oppressing Palestinians for almost 7 decades, then there would have been some weight to this decision. But recognizing something that does not exist helps no one. It is not going to help free the thousands of Palestinian prisoners. It is not going to make Israel lift the siege on Gaza. It is not going to improve the life of any Palestinians one bit. But it kind of relieves the pressure off of the Europeans as though to say, well, we're doing something. Well, if you're going to do something, make it count.
Mm-hmm. And during a recent speech at the UN, philosopher Noam Chomsky recently called for a 2-state solution, something he says is necessary before a 1-state solution can even be considered. I wanted to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I don't accept that at all. I think there has to, this whole notion of accepting that you can maintain an apartheid regime over 80% of Palestine and then somehow free a small portion of Palestine, which is the West Bank, an area that was created by Israel, delineated by Israel originally, and the Gaza Strip, which was also created by Israel. So they're two completely artificial areas within Palestine, and say, well, these areas will be exempt from the racist apartheid regime, but other parts will not. It's absurd. You either fight racism, you either fight to replace the apartheid regime that Israel imposed on Palestine with a real democracy, or you accept racism. We can't parcel the country out and say racism will be here, but no racism will be there. You either fight the regime and replace it with a democracy, or you allow it to stay.
But I mean, what makes you think that Israel would ever accept a one-state solution, considering that their whole purpose is to be a Jewish state?
Well, Israel created a single state over all of Palestine. It is the so-called Jewish state of Israel. This has nothing to do with Israel accepting it. I don't think white South Africans and the apartheid regime ever accepted the end of apartheid. But one day they woke up and there was de Klerk came up to a podium and he said, we're freeing the prisoners unconditionally and calling for free and fair elections. And everybody knew this was the end of apartheid. He didn't do this because he suddenly became a saint. He did it because of pressure, because of boycotts, divestments, sanctions, because South Africa was isolated, because people around the world spoke about this horrific injustice. Israel has taken the place of South Africa today. The Zionist regime that is ruling Palestine is the apartheid regime. And it is the apartheid regime that has to be replaced by a democracy today.
Let's move on to Palestinian farmers in the West Bank struggling to harvest their olives. Why is economic development so difficult for these farmers?
Well, Israel from the very beginning has pushed Palestinians out of the economic life of the country. They wanted to push them out and turn them into slave labor, into day laborers, unskilled day laborers. And they've done it many different ways. Nothing represents Palestinian independence and the farming and so forth of Palestine as much as the olive tree. We know that in order to build the separation wall, the segregation wall, Israel uprooted countless of olive trees, some of them as old as 800 or 1,000 years, that have been harvested and cultivated for a very long time. And this continues to this day. We see settlers who are really armed mobs who are protected by Israel, who are protected by the Israeli army, consistently cutting down and burning olive groves, cutting down and burning olive trees. This besides the fact that Palestinians quite often have no access to their olive trees because they're on the wrong side of the wall and so forth. This is part of an Israeli policy that has been in existence since the State of Israel was established for almost 7 decades.
Why does it seem like it's only affecting some Palestinian farmers? Is it only when it's close to settlements that the IDF really cracks down?
It's over a period of time since Israel was established, it's affected almost all Palestinians. In some cases, they have no more olive groves at all. In some cases, they still have some. In some cases, they have no access. In some cases, they have limited access. Depending on the region, depending on where they live specifically, and depending on the mood of the settlers and the mood of the army.
Right,
but they've all been affected. I don't think there are any Palestinians who have not been affected by this, and it's part of the economics of apartheid.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just reading about it is really sad, I guess. They only have 48 hours to really harvest all their olives, and sometimes they have to go miles away, and there's just these guards hovering over them. It's just...
Yes, and to see olive trees cut down.
Right.
Olive trees that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, suddenly cut down or burnt. You have to have a heart of stone and not to cry when you see them.
It is very tragic images there. Speaking of settlements, let's talk about Denmark's foreign minister. I mean, I know that kind of you were talking about some symbolism of recognizing the state of Palestine, but Denmark's foreign minister said that in the wake of these 3,000 settlements being built in the West Bank that Israel just announced the expansion of, that he might sanction Israel. I mean, could this be a turning point with Western powers to really move forward with actual action?
I think what the Europeans are seeing, the European governments are seeing, that there's very broad support and huge solidarity for the Palestinian cause in Europe. And there's a huge gap between the sentiment by Europeans in general and what the European governments are doing. European governments, by and large, are supporting Israel, collaborating with Israel, complicit with Israel's crimes. But I think the governments are noticing that their constituents are becoming more and more pro-Palestinian, and the Palestinian cause is very important. So they find all these symbolic gestures, all these symbolic threats, in order to relieve some of the pressure. I don't think it's going to be successful. I don't think there is any difference between building settlements in the West Bank or building settlements in the Galilee or building settlements in Jerusalem or any other part of Palestine. It's all Palestine, it's all occupied, and as long as you support the State of Israel and this idea that the State of Israel can continue to exist in Palestine, there's not going to be a difference. Israel will not stop building settlements anywhere it pleases.
And unfortunately, you see this kind of collective punishment. First, there was the Palestinian who ran over pedestrians, and then, of course, these attacks on Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem. It's just every day. Miko, I know that you have an event coming up. You're speaking here. Give us a little bit of a sense of what you've got going on. We have about 30 seconds left.
Well, next Saturday in McLean, there's going to be an event commemorating Gaza, raising some money for Gaza, and I'll be speaking there 6 p.m. next Saturday.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Everyone check out the book, The General's Son. Thank you so much for coming on for your
Pleasure.
insight. Thanks,
Thank you.
Miko.
Thanks a lot.
Before we move on, there's some breaking Earth news happening right now. A partial solar eclipse. See, solar eclipses have historically coincided with some pretty major world events, from the deaths of kings to the births of prophets. In 1919, one such eclipse even allowed physicists to confirm Einstein's theory of relativity. But today's partial solar eclipse is particularly special because it won't be until 2023 before the entire U.S. can see another one like it, which is why we're showing you a live shot of the event right now, and we'll be right back.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Obama's election marked a new dawn for hundreds of millions of people who were looking to an eloquent constitutional lawyer for hope and change in America. However, it quickly became apparent that Obama had little substance beyond the words branded by his campaign. And with a little more than a year left in his presidency, his milquetoast legacy has been embroiled by his greatest skill: words. See, Obama's team has continued, if not exacerbated, many Bush-era policies, simply rebranding them in order to appease and confuse the public into compliance. In fact, one of his first things his administration did was declare an end to the war on terror that the Bush sociopaths launched worldwide. Turns out all they wanted to do was stop calling it a war on terror, making it clear that any further military involvement abroad would simply be called, quote, overseas contingency operations. Fast forward 6 years later, and the Nobel Peace Prize winning president now has bombing campaigns in 7 different countries under his belt. There are also new terms for war. When U.S. and NATO bombed the hell out of Libya, resulting in the failed state we see today, it wasn't a war. No, it was merely a, quote, kinetic military action, according to officials. And the casualties of said wars are just collateral damage. Whenever the administration sends predator drones to bomb people, they're just surgical strikes targeting militants. Even though we now know simply being military-age male constitutes someone as a militant. And according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, less than 4% of drone victims in Pakistan are members of Al-Qaeda. And when Obama's cabinet dropped the term enemy combatant, it was a purely symbolic move to distance itself away from the Bush Guantanamo era. Unfortunately, over 140 men still remain rotting away in Gitmo, despite what they're called now on paper. And by the way, when those prisoners go on a hunger strike, it's now called a long-term non-religious fast. Torture is now enhanced interrogation techniques. And the act of kidnapping and exporting torture is simply called extraordinary rendition. As journalist Glenn Greenwald reminds us, altering the names of these policies doesn't change the fact that they're still happening. Writing, the Obama administration makes only the most cosmetic and inconsequential changes designed to generate headlines misleadingly depicting a significant reversal, while in fact retaining the crux of Bush's extremist detention policy. But obviously this rebranding tactic wasn't invented by Obama or his PR team. Propaganda was propelled with the advent of Bernays and Goebbels, whose masterful techniques have been perfected and employed for decades by governments worldwide. So let's go over just a few of the most disturbing Newspeak phrases that have warped our interpretation of reality. Again, kinetic action is really just bombing and killing people. The term mowing the lawn means literally mowing down civilians. Shockingly, this term has not only been used by Israeli military commanders to refer to the most recent bloodbath of Palestinians, but it's also been used by Obama's counterterrorism advisor, Bruce Riedel, who said this about drone strikes: "You've got to mow the lawn all the time. The minute you stop mowing, the grass is going to grow back." He's talking about human beings there. And if you think that's bad, officials also use the cute phrase shake and bake, not to describe dinner plans, but to refer to using banned white phosphorus before blowing up people with high-grade explosives. Oh yeah, government officials also think so lowly of the people they're killing with drones that they callously call them bug splats. But beyond war, in today's cutthroat capitalist world overrun by neoliberal doctrine, there needs to be a language of dehumanization employed toward almost everything, spoken among the elite class and policy heads in order to keep things running efficiently. As The Guardian points out, the term cleansing the stock is actually used to describe excess human beings by parliamentarians. After all, you can't afford to actually feel emotion, empathy, or sorrow for these paupers at the bottom of the totem pole. Which is why when it comes to the natural world, the language is even more crude. According to journalist George Monbiot, nature is natural capital. Ecological processes are ecosystem services, because apparently their only purpose is to serve us humans. Hills, forests, and rivers are described in government reports as green infrastructure. Wildlife and habitats, asset classes, and in ecosystems markets. And all of these terms have seeped into mainstream consciousness, dutifully repeated by media figures, and unfortunately, then by us. Words hold tremendous power. And if we don't reclaim our language and start seeing people instead of militants, drone victims instead of bug splats, or natural splendor instead of green infrastructure, then the voiceless are destined to be silenced forever. When you think of the growing inequality in countries around the world, zoning laws and city infrastructure are probably not the first things that come to mind. But these are the policies that often have the most direct impact on perpetuating poverty and marginalizing the most vulnerable. And urban planning is exactly the central focus of the current issue of popular socialist magazine, Jacobin. So here to discuss, I'm joined by the editor-in-chief of Jacobin magazine, Bhaskar Sunkara. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the latest issue of the magazine focuses on how privatization policies have shaped the makeup of our cities. Why did you choose this theme?
So I think often when we think about housing, when we think about other urban issues, we often see these things through purely cultural lens. So it becomes kind of an issue of, hey, this neighborhood's becoming overrun with hipsters. And you know what happens 10 years after hipsters overrun an area? Then the bankers come. So it's kind of this very glib cultural level that we're understanding these processes. But the thing is, these are actually broader issues of economic inequity. And these are issues that arise in living in a class society, especially one where we don't have a great welfare state, where there aren't adequate protections, where what the protections we do have are being eroded. So we wanted to kind of contextualize this in a broader political framework.
Well said. And one thing that's consistently emphasized throughout the issue is how neoliberalism is embedded in everything from infrastructure to zoning laws, which was really fascinating. I mean, for those that don't understand the connection, rather, can you give an example of the trend?
Well, basically, when we think about the fact that, let's say, someone like de Blasio, or even under Bloomberg, let's say those waterfront properties in Brooklyn, to use a New York example since I'm in New York now, there's these typically throughout the 20th century, you can imagine the waterfronts of Brooklyn were filled with ports, with factories, with other things that provided working class jobs for people. Now these jobs have all dissipated, so now you have areas like Greenpoint, areas in parts of Williamsburg that have factories that are unused sitting on the waterfront. So now it does make sense to some degree that these areas would be classed from industrial to possibly residential. But what's going up there? It's not going up large, let's say, public housing complexes that actually serve these workers, many of whom are now unemployed. What's going up is luxury condos. So the question is, who now benefits from the transformation of these neighborhoods? So something as simple as a rational zoning switch from industrial to residential is actually a tool for massive redistribution of wealth from people who used to live in these communities to a whole new class of people who are inhabiting these areas now, who are completely transforming them. And where are these workers going? Now more and more of them are being displaced to the suburbs, while the urban centers that they're leaving are actually becoming populated by the elite. So if anything, we're seeing kind of a scenario where American cities are starting to resemble European cities. Now, if you think about a city like Paris, it's the urban centers that are actually the wealthiest parts of the cities, and poor Muslim workers and others are living in the suburban areas that ring the city. So we're actually slowly seeing this process happen in New York and in other cities across the United States.
Really interesting. I'm glad that you talked about de Blasio, because in the magazine, Samuel Stein writes about his plan for the 80,000 new low-cost homes, of course, relying on something called inclusionary zoning. Why doesn't this tactic do anything to reduce inequality, and what type of affordable housing program can be applied to uber expensive cities like New York in order to really put a dent in inequality statistics?
So fundamentally, the problem with these programs, so just to give a little bit of background, basically an affordable housing program would say something like, okay, these luxury condos are growing up in the city, and they're going to have to go up because there's not enough new housing stock in the city. And on the basis of neoclassical economics, we basically can say that, okay, if you raise supply, then naturally more demand will be met. And obviously, if demand's met, then the price would go down. But obviously, progressive like de Blasio doesn't want to just see luxury condos spring up everywhere. He wants to at least make sure that some portion of the middle class and some workers can actually keep living in these neighborhoods. So his solution is let the developers do what they want, but make sure that there's 20%, let's say, of the house, the new construction that workers are allowed to go into in a lottery. So even if these things actually could work, what's 20% compared to the scale of the actual problem? And beyond that, even if, let's say, you're a worker able to stay in your neighborhood, let's say you're able to stay in Fort Greene as they manage to build these new condos, where are you going to shop if now your whole neighborhood is catering towards the extreme wealthy, and there's no supermarkets, and there's no public services that you're used to relied on? It's catering towards a completely different class. So your whole communities, all the networks and infrastructures they've relied on are gone. Now, as far as what affordable program can actually serve the interests of workers, well, I think the real problem here is that these programs are wonky, pinprick solutions for what's a tremendous crisis. And the only thing that could actually help workers is the construction of large-scale public housing complexes. Now, we don't have to create huge behemoth, soulless concrete buildings that are a mile high and every room looks exactly identical, but there needs to be some sort of public option, public construction for housing, and that's the only thing that'll force the private market to be honest, and that's the only thing that'll drive down prices, but it's nowhere on the agenda. Mainstream liberals that throughout the 20th century were advocating for public housing and public construction have completely dropped the issue.
Right, and once again, well said. I mean, I'm from San Francisco area, and I can't imagine a better example of this kind of gentrification gone wild than the Mission with the tech industry moving on. I wanted to play a clip that's gone viral showing kind of just several tech employees who just moved into the Mission arguing with local kids over their exclusive right to play soccer at a public park based on the fact that they reserved it on a cell phone app that, of course, these kids weren't privy to. Let's take a listen.
You don't understand. So this field has never been for the last 3 years. How long have you been in the neighborhood, bro? How long have you been in the neighborhood? Over a year. Oh my God. And you guys think that just because you have money, you can buy the field and play and take over the field.
I mean, it's just one example, of course, of thousands. I mean, these guys just were completely oblivious to the fact that the park's been used by the kids for years, and the kids did offer to share the field. Of course, the guys threw a hissy fit. I mean, the point is, how can gentrifiers be more aware of the impact they're having on these communities?
Well, it can't just be a cultural issue. It can't just be, we need to feel sorry about what we're doing, right? Because at that point, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing worse than kind of the liberal moralizing of people who are participating in these processes but feel bad about it. Honestly, I'd rather be living next door to Donald Trump or someone who's completely transactional and cold-hearted and doesn't even have this token sort of sympathy for the people they're displacing. Now, but to be honest, I think right now the situation is such that if these people actually advocate progressive values in their social lives, if they actually have a sense of justice, then we need to actually include them, or at least allow them to be included in coalitions that are fighting for things like public housing, that are fighting for things like keeping the existing rent controls and expanding them. So in other words, as we're pressuring this private stock of housing and making sure that people who are currently living in private homes can stay there, obviously there'll be less incentives. And here's where the neoliberals are right. There will be less incentive with these existing rent controls, especially if we strengthen them, for developers to build new homes.
Exactly.
But in their stead, we're going to create public housing to fill that gap. So it's a three-step process. First, expand controls on existing housing stock. 2, build more public housing. And 3, establish housing as a social right.
Everyone, check it out. I'm so sorry to cut you off. We're out of time. Everyone, check out the magazine. It goes through all these in depth. Thank you so much, Bhaskar Sankara, founder at Jacobin Magazine. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again. See, believe it or not, there's a treaty in existence that bans this type of lawlessness. It's called the UN International Convention Against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, and states that these types of activities violate principles of international law, such as those of sovereign equality, political independence, territorial integrity of states, and self-determination of peoples. Wait, so how the hell is America allowed to send in these goon squads all over the world without the UN flipping out? Well, as with many UN resolutions attempting to rein in the military-industrial complex, the U.S. simply never signed it. And furthermore, our own justice system has had its hands tied for years when it comes to prosecuting monsters like Prince and his roving ban of guns for hire. In the wake of the Blackwater convictions, Senator Patrick Leahy and Congressman David Prince introduced legislation to provide actual accountability for government contractors in the future. In a statement, Leahy said the bottom line is if contractors working on behalf of the U.S. commit crimes abroad, DOJ should be able to prosecute them. Word. And despite how many low-level employees go to prison over this scandal, justice won't truly be had until war criminal Eric Prince is rotting away next to them. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
Over the last few weeks, two surprising decisions emerged from Sweden and the UK. Earlier this month, the center-left government of Sweden announced for the first time it would be recognizing the state of Palestine. Just days later, the UK Parliament followed suit with
make Israel lift the siege on Gaza. It is not going to improve the life of any Palestinians one bit, but it kind of relieves the pressure off of the Europeans as though to say, well, we're doing something. Well, if you're going to do something, make it count.
Mm-hmm. And during a recent speech at the UN, philosopher Noam Chomsky recently called for a two-state solution, something he says is necessary before a one-state solution can even be considered. I wanted to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I don't accept that at all. I think there has this whole notion of accepting that you can maintain an apartheid regime over 80% of Palestine and then somehow free a small portion of Palestine, which is the West Bank, an area that was created by Israel, delineated by Israel originally, and the Gaza Strip, which was also created by Israel. So they're two completely artificial areas within Palestine, and say, well, these areas will be exempt from the racist apartheid regime, but other parts will not. It's absurd. You either fight racism, you either fight to replace the apartheid regime that Israel imposed on Palestine with a real democracy.
Members overwhelmingly voting to recognize Palestine as well. But while this may appear to be a major step in the right direction, some activists say that this move in fact legitimizes Israel's current status quo in the region. To discuss this news as well as other recent developments, I'm joined now by Miko Piled, son of a former IDF general and author of the book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Always amazing to have you on, Miko.
Thanks, pleasure to be here.
So basically, these recent decisions by Sweden and the UK seems like something that Palestinians should be celebrating. You disagree. Why?
Well, I think had the decision said something like, we recognize that there is a Palestine that is occupied, we realize that there's a brutal, oppressive apartheid regime that has occupied Palestine and has been oppressing Palestinians for almost 7 decades, then there would have been some weight to this decision. But recognizing something that does not exist helps no one. It is not going to help free the thousands of Palestinian prisoners. It is not going to.
What's happening, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking Set. This week, 4 Blackwater contractors responsible for the 2007 Nusser Square massacre that left 17 civilians dead in Iraq were convicted in a U.S. court on charges ranging from murder to manslaughter. Combined, the men face over a century in prison. So, justice is finally served, right? Well, except for the fact that the most guilty man of all will probably never see the inside of a courtroom or jail cell for his role in these and countless more war crimes. Yes, I'm talking about the modern mercenary industry founder, former Blackwater CEO Eric Prince. See, Prince considers his part in murdering innocent civilians around the world with no oversight God's work. And as history repeats itself, this neo-crusader has gotten off scot-free while the U.S. continues to shower his former company with billions of dollars in government contracts.